Welcome to the Children's Tradition Podcast, where we introduce families to the poetic life. Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick Foss. I'm here with my wife, Amanda Foss, and we're excited to be joined with a special guest today, Dr. Zachary Porcu. He's the author of Journey to Reality and the host of The Roots of Everything, a podcast that you and I have been binging really as of late. It's one of our favorites right now. So, Mr. Zach, thank you so much for coming on to talk with us. We're so grateful for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Well, it's kind of a humorous story of how we actually came upon Journey to Reality. I actually thought it'd be rather fun for us to share. And it kind of started with you because you were the one who first discovered the book, Journey to Reality.
Yeah, so for those of you who have the children's tradition, you'll know that Heidi Schoenbert wrote a lovely explanation of how her family applies the Benedictine rule in her home for prayer. But that Heidi sent me a Voxer and was like, I just read this book. And it is everything you love, so you must get it. It's called Journey to Reality. And of course, everyone who has TCT knows I am very much a fan of us returning to reality in these crazy times where people are so disconnected from reality. And so sure enough, I got the book. But what usually happens when I buy books is that then Patrick steals them from me. So he did get to win and read it first. But at this point, we have both read it. And sure enough, it was just such a wonderful introduction to really get to the heart and at the root of so many of the problems we have in modernity, and we don't even know why. So I'm super excited to have you on, Dr. Zach, and to get to have this conversation and share just your wisdom and insight to these issues for everyone who uses the curriculum or just homeschool families in general.
Well, and upon of our reading upon the book, when I started to look at, just about the author and, read your, just kind of short kind of biography that was there. And I'm like, he looks really familiar. And I just kind of went with it. And then 2 weeks later, maybe 2 or a few weeks later, whatever it was, I'm walking past you and I'm like, we attend the same parish. That's right. And now we get to bug you all the time. Yeah. So this is great. So it feels like this was inevitable, I think.
It's a small world. I mean, this is kind of how American Orthodoxy is like everyone is one step removed away from everybody else in American Orthodoxy. So here we are.
Now we are. Well, so with Journey to Reality, so I know it is true. She does tend to order books and I do steal them. And I tend to read them rather obsessively, as that was, I know, one of our conversations. So I'm just curious, even with you, I think a question that I would love to even just kind of show, what prompted you really to write that book, particularly highlighting, the philosophy we need to recover realism?
Yeah, so I was assigned as a teaching fellow at my PhD school at the Catholic University of America in DC. And when you're there, if you're on a merit stipend, they make you teach classes. And that's also so that the star professors don't have to be in the classroom. They can just do research. So we had to teach all the introduction to theology classes for all incoming freshmen had to take this at Catholic. So, that course was, we just need you to cover the Old Testament, the New Testament, church history, the church fathers, and all of doctrine. So can you just do that in one semester? And, so you're incredibly pressed for short readings that can get to the bottom of these things. There's a lot of content to go through. But the problem is, and what I found teaching this course for 5 years was that you can say the what of theology even to like lifer Catholic students. But if they're in any way kind of checked out or why am I in this class? There's also 7 a.m. required class, So it's a very rough audience in that sense. And you can say all the what to them, but if they don't have the conceptual framework for why they should care about this in the first place, then it doesn't matter to them. It just goes in one ear and out the other. And it may even be nonsensical, or incoherent. So I say, well, okay, the Eucharist is literally Christ. Well, it's not literally meat. When you pick it up, you're like, this looks like bread to me. So what does that statement even mean? And why does it matter that, okay, we have to talk about the creeds and the creed and the councils. And why does Christ have 2 natures? Who cares? I can tell you that Christ has 2 natures. I can tell you that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit share one essence, but nobody cared. And that wasn't a way to get freshmen at 7 a.m. to sit up and pay attention and can contribute. So I started writing these little, what I called articles, which are just like a couple pages long, just to, as quickly as possible, get to the what, but nest that what within a conceptual framework that was actually coherent and relatable to them on the ground and their, in their everyday lives. So a good example of this is when in the section on the Trinity, I give a very brief introduction to the what of the Trinity, one essence, three persons. And then I say, this is a complicated topic and we could talk a lot more about it. But in my experience, that's not what most people care about. What most people care about is the answer to the question, who cares that God is three persons in one essence? Why does that matter? And so I said, why don't we try this on? And this is how I end the section, I'm like, as you know, I say, if God wasn't a Trinity, there'd be no such thing as love. And I use that kind of rhetoric all throughout the book to introduce the next section, because then the students are like, okay, well, I care about love. So now I have some reason to care about why we're talking about this topic. And I found that once I was able to lay the conceptual framework for all of these things, then the students are like, oh, I see. No one ever told me why I should care about this before in my life, which is crazy when you think about it. Because I had students who had come from, who had been in Catholic school for their whole life, K through 12. And when they came there, they were just kind of like, I don't know. I'm just here to say the answers. I'm here to say the answers that I'm supposed to say for catechism.
Well, that's exactly how most people in modernity approach all education, right? Is just tell me what answers I need for the test, right? I think that's what's intriguing to me as someone who was homeschooled myself. So now I'm a second generation homeschooler. And I think a lot of people 20 years ago thought homeschooling alone was a solution. Like, well, if you just homeschool, it's fine. Like, we can use a lot of the same resources. We can still educate to the state standards that are made by a bunch of secularists. That's all fine because we're also reading the Bible at home. We're praying as a family. And that will like compensate for the fact that, you know, these materials, and honestly, I don't even think they thought of it as compensation. I think a lot of people just did it thinking that, well, this is like morally neutral knowledge. And then, you know, we'll add scripture and Bible in, and that will give a full Christian education. And so what I love about what you're talking about there is with theology, you have these big topics, but we have to have prerequisite knowledge to even understand why we care. And I feel like so much of my time is spent going, okay, I know this, we do this thing in education, but why do we do that? Like, what is the assumptions and the prerequisite beliefs that led you to assume that this is what knowledge is, or this is what makes a valid type of learning, or things like that?
Yeah, we assume our assumptions are correct. And we don't examine them, right? We really don't do what Socrates says, which is the unexamined life, right? We actually don't then look at those assumptions that are informing our beliefs as well as then our actions. And particularly on the scope of educational philosophy, pedagogy, all of that, so much of it is, even quote unquote, what we would say, not just in the public school system, but even in the private school system. And you can see it in many even classical programming. It's very utilitarian. In the sense that as long as we have the right method, as long as we have the right system, then it's going to work out, right? And because why? It's been quantified, it's been data selected, it's been data proven. And so therefore, as long as we implement this thing, it's going to work out. So why is that thought? It just seems like, which is rooted right in this Cartesian form of thinking. It's so embedded in our assumptions. Why is it so there?
Why is the way of thinking about knowledge in terms of methodology?
Yeah. So in terms of that methodology, terms of that methodology approach.
Yeah. And let me just say, let me take one step back and respond to something you said, which was, you're like, oh, well, as long as we're at home and we're doing prayers together and reading the Bible. And I was immediately thinking, yeah, this is the same kind of mindset that thinks if we just teach the 10 Commandments in schools, we somehow don't have a secular school system anymore. But we completely have a secular school system. And it doesn't matter if you teach the Bible. You can teach the Bible all day long in secular school, and you still have a secular school. So because of our imaginative framework, which I'm sure we'll talk about. So the West, I mean, this is a long thing, but the West has a very one way you might define the West is by its certain kind of methodology. By the West, I mean everything from scholasticism till now. So like high Middle Ages until, because the West is a complicated, what does that mean? That's also something that's very undefined in my experience in classical and homeschool types of settings. We just assume the West means like everything good. And we have to defend the West against the people who hate the West. And this is too generalized. But so just to talk about this period of history from scholasticism through the Enlightenment till now, there is the thing that Catholic scholasticism, Protestant reformers, and secular Enlightenment people have in common is that they're all shaped by this idea that if we can just find and acquire the right method, we will then unlock all truth. And the Catholics did this through this idea of like the scholastic modeling. They wanted to model everything, and they were all, super genius polymaths who knew everything, and so they made all these models for reality that led to a lot of improvements about things. They actually invented new forms of logic just to articulate the Trinity. So that's an example of when theology actually drove the development of logic and reason, which a lot of atheists will say was the opposite, right? And then in the Reformation, there's this concern about how to interpret Scripture. So that's a methodological concern. That's actually the whole religious crisis of the West at that time, which was, if the Bible is going to be our source, how do we interpret it? That becomes like the major question of the Reformation. And then the Enlightenment guys, who later are going to form the basis for the secular civilization that tries to tear down religion, most of those guys are actually raised in a Catholic or Protestant context, so they're informed by this methodology of trying to investigate the world, to model it like in scholasticism, or to unlock the secrets of Scripture from the Reformation. And so they say, oh, we're not Christian, we're atheists. But they still have this imaginative framework about methodology. And so then they go apply that to science, and they do the whole scientific revolution thing. So the question about methodology is sort of the linking question that defines Western thought from, like I say, from scholasticism onward, even across groups that normally would not identify with each other as doing the same project, like Catholics and Protestants, like any religious people and the secular Enlightenment guys. But they're all having the same conversation, because the assumption is if we get the method right, then we'll know how the world works. And that is, interestingly, not how a lot of previous civilizations thought about it.
So then what would be the counter, like ancient mind of approaching knowledge contrasted with methodology?
So the distinction that I make in the book, and we've been talking about this in the epistemology series on my podcast that just ended on Monday, is that we have the result of this methodology conversation in the West was this idea of, okay, there's objective knowledge, which we can prove, and then there's subjective knowledge, which that's kind of up to each individual person. And that's sort of how the Enlightenment guys end up framing the whole problem of knowledge and method that all of us have had to live in and think in since then. And the alternative that I offer, that's much more like what a regular society would do, a natural society or an ancient society, is what I call participatory knowledge. So the idea is that you have to look at knowledge not as this kind of mechanistic binary, do you know it or not? You have to look at it in terms of a relationship. So you're married, do you know your spouse or not? And it's like, that question doesn't really make sense when you think about a relationship. You can ask that at the beginning of the marriage, and the answer will be, well, yeah, I know my spouse. We're newlyweds. We're learning still, but I know this person enough. We got married after all. But then you know your spouse more in 5 years and in 10 and in 40. And so when you realize that knowledge is like that, like relational knowledge, same with any relationship, your kids, your parents. I have some of my best friends. I've been friends with them for 20 years, literally, and those relationships have changed and grown over the years. And so you wouldn't say that any of this knowledge is because let's wind it back. In the situation where I'm a newlywed, obviously I know my spouse less than when I know my spouse now, 12 years into my marriage. But I wouldn't say that I didn't know my spouse at the beginning of the marriage. Knowledge is something that you grow in over time because it's personal, because it's participatory. And the reason that I know my wife is because I'm a participant in the relationship, not because I've used a method on her to like understand what she is. Now I've got the correct method. Now I understand my wife.
So in the children's tradition, we use the term poetic knowledge, which I think is describing exactly what you're meaning, right? That it is a knowledge by experience. You could call it poetic experience. You could call it a sensory emotional approach to knowledge, right? That you have to interact with the thing. It's like you said, it's completely relational. You could call it loving attention, right? That through this type of experiential, participatory, loving, I think it's St. Augustine who said something to the effect of, if you love something, you have to know it, but to know something, really, you have to love it, right? So that knowledge and love are completely intertwined in the Christian imagination. And so that is the primary way of knowing. And I'm really intrigued by your take on this, because a little pushback we've had at times is that, oh, this poetic knowledge you're talking about, that's like for preschoolers. Like, oh yeah, like preschoolers need a gymnastic approach to education, that more musical. Okay, maybe like a little bit in the school years, but definitely by like upper elementary, middle school, high school, like it's time for analysis. It's time for like a departure from this participational poetic experience. And so one of the first things you said to me, actually, I think I was explaining the curriculum to you, and I said, well, the curriculum prioritizes gymnastic and musical education because children are so inherently gymnastic, right, from their earliest days. And then your response to me was to say, well, everyone is gymnastic. And so I would love for you to expand on that, how this is not a phase. We're not talking about a type of participatory knowledge that, oh, you graduate from in 5th grade.
Or is it inferior? Because we tend to hear that
yeah.
the analytical phase is superior and then the poetic mode phase is inferior. So lay that, but then graduate from it as soon as you can.
Yeah, I mean, those are all just ways we've been trained to talk about knowledge because of our very particular history. And I get into that more in the podcast and all that stuff. But I mean, the reality is that, if you stop and think about this for like 5-10 minutes, you'll realize that you don't actually function that way. No adult really functions that way. And you know this if you've had any conversations with anybody about anything, because like it's everywhere. We just don't see it. So, I'll give you a few examples. Like in my house, we are very serious about movies and movie watching, and then we watch movies with other people, which is always a mistake. And I will say, not really, but
this is why me and you get along, because we love film.
We had coffee the other day and we just talked about Batman the whole time.
Anyway, you're nerding out. Sorry to interrupt your train of thought.
Yeah. So we watch a movie with somebody and we're like, okay, movie's over. What did you think? Now, growing up, that there's always a half hour after the movie in which we all talk about the movie. And then people will be like, oh, I liked it. And you're like, okay, what did you like about it? They're like, I don't know. I just liked it. Like, they're mad that you're asking them this question. And you're like, well, I want to hear. It's like, they don't know. There's no analytic going on for a lot of people with these things. Now, is that inherently worse? It sounds like I'm picking on people. Not necessarily, actually. I mean, I like it. I like analyzing movies because my wife and I are movie nerds. But like a way to cast this instinct charitably is with the concept of a moral aesthetic. So when people watch a movie, I have friends who are not intellectuals. God bless them. Because they could do something very simple and easy that takes no time at all, which is they watch something and they go, I didn't like that. That was gross. That was weird. And it is. So, like, in other words, they see something that's immoral. And rather than have to, like, intellectualize what's wrong with this movie, their moral aesthetic is so formed and trained that they can reject it on aesthetic basis. And they're correct that it's immoral, but they didn't have to do any of these mental gymnastics to explain and justify what's wrong with the movie. They're just like, nah, I didn't like that. That was a weird, gross movie, and it was like kind of demonic. I don't know. And they don't have anything else to say. But like, that's valid. And in fact, that's how all people in all of these cultures have always functioned in human history because their religion and their worldview gave them an aesthetic. And that aesthetic was meaning bearing, and it defended these people's souls in a time when no one could read or do like the ancient Shinto Japanese did not know the laws of logic, but they could encounter something and go, that's immoral. We don't do that. And they have no explanation for you. So it's the same thing too with I'll give you another example with like ethnic Christians. I know that in the States a lot of Anglo kind of types will look down on ethnic Christians, like Mexican Catholics, or cultural Catholics, or Italian. I'm Italian. I have a lot of those people in my family, and they'd be like, oh, well, they can't explain their religion. They don't know where in the Bible it says that, and we get a lot of this kind of stuff. And I'm like, is that a problem though? Obviously, it's better if you can explain your religion, but the like so-called ethnic religious people, and you get this with Protestants too. You go to the Bible Belt and they just have a very basic, they're not scholars. But what do they have? They have a culturally shared, clear aesthetic about what is and what is not good and moral. And it's sub-rational. And I think that's more in the sense that it's sub-articulable. But I think that's stronger. I think that's more lasting. I think those roots are deeper. So sorry, I'll give you one other very weird example. Somebody the other day was asking me, I'm from a New York Italian family, and so people always ask me about the mafia and stuff. And they're like, I was saying how, like, yeah, all these mafia guys, and you see this in the movies too, they're very religious and they're very superstitious. And the person I was talking to was like, how can they be religious? They kill people. Like, how do they still believe in God? And I had to think about this for a second. And I said, well, here's the thing. Their religion is so ingrained into their worldview that they don't have the convenience to stop believing in it just because they're bad. Like, they might even tell you, yeah, we're bad, we're probably going to hell. But like, they can't let go of the belief because that's just how the world works. Whereas I see a lot of people who are more secularized about their religion, they're really full of fervor and piety and zeal about their religion. And they go really hard, especially converts, And then later, when they maybe, move in with their boyfriend or girlfriend, or they start doing something that doesn't line up to the teachings of the religion that they were very zealous about. And then somehow magically they decide that their religion was false. And that means they're like, oh no, I don't believe in that anymore. I don't believe in God. I know somebody who was like who kind of met this description, and then life got difficult and he was like, yeah, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God anymore. And it's like, okay, so what do we mean by believe? Because if it's just assent, if it's just I agree to these sets of statements, the so-called analytic, like, oh, I figured it all out with analysis, but it wasn't in here in the poetic gymnastic mode, then you have the capacity to just drop these sets of beliefs. Like, that doesn't strike me as deeper roots. That strikes me as more shallow roots.
Yeah. As you use the analogy of your friend, I have friends like that, as well, and I love them, right? And their simplicity, though, demonstrates, right, this still faithful moral orientation to what is good and true and beautiful. And I think of it how that's displayed in every day in such simple things, like if you have a good meal. They can't deduce from that through all the different aspects of whites. They can just tell you it tasted good. It was really good.
Probably most people about cooking.
Yeah, it's just that was a really good meal. Or I even think of like a sports team. I grew up around sports. That's something I inherited. So much of my family, it's football, basketball, baseball, everything. And why do we like the Lakers? We like the Lakers. It's just the home team. It's, is it that I love purple so much because it's, golden? Not really, but it's just, even though it is the color of royalty, but it's just, nevertheless, it's what we receive and we enjoy it. And so it's like this, we all have this intuitive knowledge that's just there. Some of it we've received, some of it we've gained through experience, others through some type of relationship that we've gained. And when you have a relationship with you, your possession of it feels so much more holistic. Rather than if I know something merely through cerebral engagement, it's detached. It feels so much more disconnected, to the point that it's easier to discard it, contrast to the relationship, that I feel a sense of bonding, unity, and identity with that thing or that person.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pressing on this a little bit, because I don't know that people appreciate the extent to which the purely analytic mode actually contains a worldview, and that worldview is not compatible with Christianity, actually. So let me explain that. So the part of the problem that occurred in the scholastic period, this was kind of an accident, I guess, is that, and this starts with Anselm, which is they were like, well, we have all these arguments for everything because they're scholastics, and they're like, but arguments that argue for the existence of God based on revelation or tradition or scripture aren't as have as wide a utility as arguments based on pure reason, because you can't use an argument based on, the Catholic magisterium's authority on a Muslim, because he'll just be like, well, I don't care about that, I'm a Muslim. So they were like, okay, well, an argument that's just based on pure reason, that is an argument you can use with a Muslim. And so you could see the obvious apologetic utility of that. So in its context, there's nothing really wrong with that. But it actually kind of led to this weird trend in scholasticism that started to favor reason alone arguments outside of these other types of arguments: historical, revelatory, embodied, like the magisterium is a group of people, sacramental, traditional. In other words, all the embodied forms of knowledge, all the forms of knowledge that have persons at the center. And there was this kind of move to pure reason. Now, of course, I'm super overgeneralizing, skipping several centuries, but by the time you get to the Enlightenment guys, they are basically on this crusade to show that the universe is not full of persons. So Johannes Kepler actually says this I was skimming through some of his stuff, and I was like, hey, because he goes, my goal, he's very explicit about this, is I need to show people that they have to stop thinking about the world and the universe as being peopled by all these random intelligences. In other words, like spirits. I need to show people that the world is just a giant clock. It's just a mechanism. It's not full of persons. And when you look at all the Enlightenment guys' epistemology, the way that they're thinking about the universe in these mechanistic terms, they want to reduce everything to this giant clock. That's where deism comes from. And we haven't moved that far from that with the simulationist theory. That's just another type of deism, clockwork deism. And so, but you're like, okay, well, what's wrong with that? Because obviously that's allowed us to produce all this technology and whatever. The issue is that viewing the world primarily in terms of pure reason and analytics is kind of dependent on assuming that the world is a inert, lifeless, disincarnational mechanism or a set of algorithms that, in other words, that all of reality can be reduced to a set of processes, impersonal processes, and that truth itself is some kind of a weird abstraction. There's truth out there, there's information, we're going to synthesize it, In other words, a universe that's not incarnational, a universe that is depersonalized. Why is this the opposite of the gospel? Because we believe, all Christians believe this, that Christ is himself the truth. He says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. He's not saying what I'm saying is true. He says that too. But what he's saying is, he is himself the truth. This is why John belabors this point. He is the logos, the logic of all reality. If you know this book, Christ, the Eternal Tao, they basically take the Tao Te Ching, and the ancient Chinese had this concept of the Tao, which is basically the concept of the logos that the Greeks have. And they're like, oh, Chinese people, the missionary said, did you know that the Tao became a man? And they were like, oh. So, that's the point, is that truth itself is a person. And that leads to a totally different view of reality, in which truth cannot be reduced to mechanism. And therefore, the analytic cannot be the highest form of knowledge, because whenever you encounter truth at all, you're encountering Christ. Any truth, even 2 + 2 is 4, you're encountering Christ, which means you and the object of your knowledge are persons. All truth all acquisition of knowledge is a personal relationship. And so it's no wonder to me that meanwhile in Byzantium, and if you read the church fathers, like the Desert Fathers, they will say that the intellect is the highest part of the mind of the person. There's the belly, there's the heart, the Platonic triad. But they don't define the mind in terms of mere analytic ability like a computer. The highest function of the mind is the nous, because the highest purpose of the mind is prayer.
Well, that connects to, there's a book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture by Joseph Pieper, and he talks about the mind as ratio and intellectus. And what struck me about that was that it seems like ratio is describing that rational element, whereas what he refers to as the intellectus is referring to that noetic, right? That receptive ability to have communion, right? Communion with God through prayer. And so in that sense, it's really interesting to me because it is both pre-rational, like we're talking about, this receiving reality and truth into yourself, that you're receiving it from God. God is, and truth is in him, and then you receive it. But then it's also post-rational, because you might receive something, and then, like your relationship that you used earlier, right? You might get married or be dating someone, and at first you're just enjoying their presence, you're enjoying being together. But a wise person somewhere along the way will pause for a moment and like, well, I need to think about this. Like, what are our dynamics? Do we spur one another on to be more like God? Are we encouraging one another? Are we actually really unhealthy? And this is not a good dynamic. Like, you have to, for a moment, stand outside and analyze the relationship to make sure, okay, is this a good thing? Is this a healthy thing? But then a healthy relationship will go back into that more poetic experiential, right? The worst thing in the world would be to be analyzing your spouse all the time, right? That's super destructive if you're just like, well, you did this or you don't do that. But all of this comes together to make me think that we often talk about the necessity of receiving reality. That's something we talk a lot about, and we call it the receptive mode. And I wonder if you could connect that to tradition for us, because one thing in modernity is we all view ourselves as expressive individuals, right? And so what was really interesting to me was that really classical education was the first thing that taught me that I don't get to just cherry pick whatever I want. Like, it was through classical education and experiencing the great tradition of literature and the great books and all these things that suddenly it was like, well, I don't get to decide like, oh, I'm just not a fan of Plato. He's just not my shtick. Or, I'm like, Dante, I've read better. Like, it's just,
well, it gave us a posture of piety.
Yes,
it helped us to and I think one of the books that was somewhat a catalyst, even because so much of what you were saying, Zach, and especially I know through your series that you did on The Roots of Everything, when we're talking about like our epistemological assumptions, right? The criteria that we're operating with, and actually looking to see, are these proper? Are these right? Are these real? Are they consistent and harmonious with reality? And I think so much of how I knew knowledge, it was Gnostic. It was disembodied. It was fragmented. And so the analytical mode just fit right into that, because I already looked at everything from not the whole puzzle together. I already looked at it as a bunch of separate pieces. So that was very normal to me. But I know it was Nancy Pearcey's book on total truth that gave us, I remember just about 11 years ago when we read it, that gave us sort of our first window. Oh, wait, truth is not something that is abstract and arbitrary, but rather there is a singular source here. So it's more of a sort of, think of it, truth rather than as like this component where each thing is in its separate drawer and it's in here and it's in the separate file cabinet. It's more of this web of how it's integrated, and it is synthetical, and it's coming all ultimately right from the one who is the way, the truth, and the life, which is Christ himself. And so this idea of trying to understanding truth, like I said, in this embodied holistic form was something that almost felt incredibly liberating, because it felt like my sense of humanity was being put back together. Not just like this idea that my soul almost felt like it was like completely torn apart here, but understanding that it almost felt like I'm becoming one again.
Well, and there's a lot of anxiety that can come to, this can come in so many facets, right? This can come down to, as a Christian, trying to figure out your theology. This can be as a homeschool parent thinking that you have to piecemeal your child's education and that you have to evaluate and analyze every single part of it, as opposed to having, again, that tradition to receive from. So yeah, that's kind of just background on how classical education kind of moved us in that direction of like, this is going to be exhausting if we have to constantly be figuring out every single thing, standing above it all, right? We have to stand over everything, analyze everything. And so I know just the great tradition was the first step for us in being like, oh, like I can just receive this beautiful thing. I can just like take it and give it to my children and then trust that because it's people wiser than me. It stood the test of time and all of that.
Yeah. And it's also that, I mean, I think that what I've observed in classical education circles is that there's often this anxiety about getting the right method for your classical education. And then when you get the right method, then that's going to guarantee education. And something that I was talking about on Monday's episode at the end of the epistemology series was in order to become good knowers of things, you need to let go of the anxiety about certainty and realize that just as knowledge is relational, that also means it's an ongoing process. It's the same. We talk about, you learn your relationships better. It's the same with language or games or hobbies of any kind. It's like you're always going deeper into it, further in and further up. And so you try things and you see how it goes. And you are at peace with the process of life being organic rather than thinking, I tried all of these solutions to the problem and none of them worked. And then I wasted my whole life never getting to the right solution. And the answer is you have to stop thinking about life in terms of a problem that needs to be solved by a method. And now does this sound kind of like vague and woo about, like, oh, just like, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. No, it is about the destination, obviously, because we have a teleology. We want to go somewhere. But part of that teleology is that the growth is something that happens over time. So you wouldn't, like if you're a chess player, you wouldn't stress out about, or a tennis player or whatever, you don't stress out about that. You just keep doing it. You're like, oh, I learned this wrong from this teacher. Well, I had this teacher and he kind of taught, I learned this good thing from this teacher. I learned this other good thing that was different from this other teacher. And over time, you're kind of learning and growing because you're continuing to aim at the goal, which is to be a good chess player or a good tennis player or a good husband or whatever it is. And you put all these things together and then you get there. And, like a good example, in the beginning of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, he gives a list, if you remember, all the things he's learned from all the most important people in his life. From this person, I learned that. From this person, I learned that. He wasn't obsessed with method. He realized that he was a student of the world. He opened his eyes and learned.
Well, and I think that's such an important thing for parents to remember, that to exactly like stop trying to get the system right. Like I think I know as a mom, I can be just as in danger of falling for that trap over. Like I just need, things aren't going as well as I'd like. What's my system? I just need a new system. And if I can just find the right system, everything.
Or we reduce it to a checklist. And, Charlotte Mason defined education as a disciplined life in an atmosphere. And the atmosphere point has always stood out to me. And so much of what I want to, and we'll sometimes we're very good for each other because I'm always like, is the atmosphere right? Right? Because that makes the pursuit of education, right? It makes it really an enjoyable, right, pursuit at that point, rather than like it's chaos, it's turbulent. At the end of the day, if I can give my children good memories and a good atmosphere that's warm, it's hospitable, it's embracive, then okay, then it's rather than, hey, did I check off this? Did I check off this? Did I check off this? Because if knowledge truly is participational, then our form of education is much different than was the checklist accomplished. Because that form of participation is going to come in so many different forms and facets.
I think there's intriguing research, even just like on a polyvagal level, that your nervous system cannot participate in relationship with anything if it's in a state of anxiety and stress, which a lot of times our imposition of systematization and treating children like they're little machines rather than human beings, right? If we don't have human rhythms in our family, if we don't give them time, like if they're having a hard moment, humans have hard moments, and you just have to be there with them in that, instead of being like, but we have math to do. It's like, well, they don't care. Their whole system has shut down now. So you have to restore that balance.
Well, and if we reduce knowledge to merely an intellectual engagement, we treat them like little mini subcomputers. And did they get their download for the day? And if they got their download, they got the data, it's in, and somehow they're going to figure it out, rather than now, are they participating with what is true? Are they participating with what is good? So that very thing actually is not something that is detached knowledge, but it's personal knowledge that the goodness becomes them and they absorb that very thing itself.
Which now I know we wanted to talk to you about Rene Descartes, and that's a central piece in all this, I think, because as far as like knowing what to give our children, right, a lot of it comes from, yes, we think we're just giving them ideas, that it's an information download, that's what education is. So could you talk to us about how Rene Descartes' ideas kind of influenced us in modernity, that we have this split between embodiment and ideas that then infiltrates how we think about knowledge and education and things like that?
How we think about humans, really, from that.
I mean, how we think about everything. There's so many philosophy courses that I've seen just getting outside, like, oh, philosophy, and day one we're starting with Descartes. Obviously, this is a mistake because you should start with Socrates. But the fact that happens all the time is very indicative, because he's sort of the father of modernity in a lot of ways. I talk about this at length on the show. I actually think Luther is a parallel figure to him. I thought that was an interesting conversation we could come back to. But Descartes really defines for the modern era everything about our epistemology, how we think about beliefs and knowledge, our anthropology, how we think about the person. It's just everything. And in fact, I would argue, I'm not the only one to argue this, like all of philosophy after Descartes is just kind of a response to Descartes. People often say like, oh, well, all philosophy is sort of a footnote to Plato, but like, I don't know if that's true. I mean, in the sense that, did he figure it all out first? But really and literally, all the philosophers that come after Descartes are responding to Descartes. Hume tries to solve his problems and fails. Kant flips out when he realizes that this means science isn't possible, tries to solve the problem and fails. And then every single philosopher, going all the way up to the postmodernists. Postmodernism is like a reaction to the fact that philosophy failed to solve Descartes' problems. Like, all of it is Descartes' influence. He starts this. So what's going on with this? Well, and I don't know how much you want me to summarize about his project and what he's doing.
Maybe just a brief intro. Like, let's say if someone doesn't even know, like, that this is the first time they've heard that name, maybe just a quick summary of his ideas that are the most influential, and why we're talking about him now, hundreds of years later.
Yeah, if you've heard the term, if you know his name, you probably know it from the phrase "I think, therefore I am," which kind of encompasses a lot of the problems. So, for various historical reasons, he was concerned with what he says is refuting skepticism, and so he tries to double down on skepticism to show that what knowledge is possible. So he basically says, look, here's how we'll do it. If there's a reason for every single thing you could believe, we'll just doubt. If there's any reason to think you can doubt it, just doubt it, because you could be dreaming, you could be hallucinating. If there's any reason at all to doubt it, just throw it in the trash. And that way, if we do this, when we arrive at the thing that cannot be doubted, we'll know with absolute certainty, this concept goes on to haunt modernity for the next 500 years, what is really true. And so he arrives at a few conclusions. One is, he must exist, because this is the I think, therefore I am. Because if he says, I don't exist, then that's a contradiction, because who's saying that? So he's like, okay, I must exist. And then through other complicated elements, he arrives at the conclusion that God exists. So he uses a form of what's called the ontological argument. That's another story. There's a way, if you don't know this, there's a way to kind of demonstrate that the concept of God must exist from pure reason. It's controversial whether or not this works. I think it does, but it doesn't show as much as people maybe want it to. Anyway, he proves to his own satisfaction that God must exist rationally. It's a contradiction to say that God doesn't exist. And then he goes, well, God's not a wicked, evil deceiver, so he wouldn't create this bizarro world that's just fake and everything's an illusion. So the material world must be true. Now, this is a huge problem, because many have argued that his solution doesn't actually work. His attempt to bail himself out of total skepticism fails, and that's why the rest of us never get there. But in laying out the question in this way, he makes a very subtle move that people don't realize, which is he does two things that go on to influence everyone, which is he starts with the assumption that the individual isolated subject is the starting point for knowledge. There's just him in his room writing his little thing by himself and his brain. So, in other words, there's no incorporation of relational knowledge, community, his history, tradition, like the fact that even his categories for what he considers valid or invalid or real or not or whatever, or rational, those categories are themselves conditioned by his historical context. But he just ignores that completely. He assumes that the isolated individual, armed with his method, reason, can arrive at truth claims. And that's a very ahistorical way of looking at it. It ignores the entire poetic form and ignores everything. And then the second thing he does is he problematizes the relation between the knower and the known. So what does that mean? That means he assumes that just because he's seeing something doesn't mean he's necessarily seeing it. He needs some certainty, some proof to guarantee that he's not deceived by his senses. So in other words, it's kind of like innocent until proven guilty. He assumes that the objects of knowledge are guilty until proven innocent, meaning we're not going to believe anything by default until we have a reason to believe it. And this goes on to, when you make that assumption, you undermine all knowledge because there's actually no solution. That's what we've learned in the last 500 years of doing philosophy. There is no solution to Descartes' issue because he starts with the premise, assumption, not conclusion, that knowledge is problematic and we need a method to fix the problem of knowledge. Whereas a regular person from 400 BC would just assume that your faculties are working properly until you have a reason to think they're not. All you have to do is flip it, and all of a sudden there's no problem of knowledge. They're just like, oh, I must be seeing a chair over there. Why would I think any other reason? Sometimes I dream I'm seeing a chair, but who cares? Now, why did he think this? There's historical context to that. But the point is that, I mean, there's a lot of direction this goes, but you see how that kind of methodology ends up making us obsessed with method, because method is the only thing that's going to save us from chronic doubt and skepticism and nihilism. And
so
because
I was going to say, so the think therefore I am really becomes in the rise of the autonomous self.
Yeah.
The rise of the individualized self. And instead of just engaging with reality in a holistic, intuitive, naturalistic sense, we have to now impose a rule upon it. We have to impose the system, the formula, the method. So rather than actually extracting from what it is and taking from what it is, I impose meaning into it for my own subjective individual thought.
Yeah, exactly. And if you think about this and you run with that ball, you realize that, oh, actually in his premises are the structures for radical subjective individualism, because that's actually how he starts and frames the problem. So no wonder 400 years later, we have total widespread nihilism, relativism, subjectivity, and postmodernism, because there is no way out when you assume knowledge is impossible from the beginning, functionally. And you assume that the individual trapped in his brain with a method is the starting point for this. There's no way out.
And you see how pervasive this is even today, not only with the quote unquote secular man, but you see it with religious man who talks with that same level of individualism with how they approach things, how they approach even worship, how they approach reading the Bible, how they approach liberty and conscience and everything. So that same spirit of individuality is something that isn't just for the secular man that's there. It's very prevalent with the religious man as well.
I mean, in my series, I have a whole episode on just this part. I argue that Descartes is really doing something that's already happening with Luther in the Reformation, more or less at the same time in history. Because what's happening with the Reformation? Well, they said, okay, we're going back to the Bible, forget all these councils. Okay, so then you have this problem. How do I read the Bible? And so actually, if you think about it, this is very parallel to Descartes. You're the isolated individual, knowing subject, sitting there with your method, whatever your biblical hermeneutic is, trying to arrive at certainty about what the Bible means. Like that's the parallel thing that's going on in religion. And then Descartes, you could argue, goes on to influence all the Enlightenment thinkers. But like that's just what modernity is. So if you take Luther, because Luther, I mean, many people know how he was very anxious about salvation. And that's why he had this kind of epiphany.
You wanted assurance.
Yeah, he wanted assurance of salvation. It's a quest for religious certainty. And then Descartes also has this quest for logical certainty. And those two, I kind of argue, are basically the pillars for everything in modernity. So it's not just like, oh, look how the secular people don't know anything. It's like everything in modernity is obsessed with certainty. And all of our modern arguments are arguments about which method do we use to fix the certainty problem in biblical hermeneutics, in logic, in scientific modeling, in politics. Which of these nation state formulae, fascism, communism, liberalism, which of these methods are going to guarantee utopia?
So how do you think, or do you think that tradition does heal that wound, so to speak, of modernity that we all have, that we're left with we're this subject on our own thinking we have to figure everything out, and yet tradition offers this alternative path that says, no, you actually don't have to figure everything out. You have to submit to and receive this tradition. Do you see that as the way that is healed, or do you think there's other ways?
Well, there's just no other way to exist as a person. And when you unwrap what that actually means, like I said, with the poetic versus analytic mode, when you stop and think about it, you realize that you already live this way. You just already live this way. We're just trained to think that we don't. We're trained to think that we're rational, isolated individuals, but we're not. Nobody is. And the example I gave on the show was, you don't know that H2O is water. Not from personal, direct scientific observation. Like maybe one person listening to this has done that, whatever experiment. But 90% of what you know about science, you receive from authority. You believe it because somebody in authority told it to you. That's like all human knowledge, because nobody can go and test all of these things. And so when you receive things from authority, this is very important too, because people kind of, modern people go like, okay, well, this isn't possible. And they, boom, go to the other extreme. And in this case, it's, you say, okay, well, tradition is actually how you know everything already. You already know most of what you know from your cultural context, what philosophers call historicity, your historical situation, and what you receive from tradition. You already know everything like that. And you just need to get on board. And so people will go, oh, okay, so I just need to find the perfect authority and then submit myself absolutely to that authority. And do you see how that's still Methodism? That's still not Wesleyanism, but that's still an obsession with method. Okay, so the correct method is I find the correct authority and then I do whatever that authority tells me to. That's the correct method. It's like, that's not what we're saying either. That's still this weird mechanistic thing. So what do you have to do therefore? And this is all kind of a pitch for the last series we did, because I spent the whole episode on this, where I talk about there's just all these different methods. So in the 20th century, after the World Wars, when postmodernism was in full bloom, it took that long for a group of philosophers to actually realize what was wrong with the Enlightenment and how the Enlightenment and Descartes and all these guys put us on this path. And this, in philosophy, this is called the hermeneutics movement in philosophy. It's kind of an outgrowth of Heidegger, but really, I think the main figure is Hans Georg Gadamer. He wrote this book called Truth and Method, and there's a bunch of kind of associated scholars. Anyway, what they did was they critiqued all of this stuff that we're talking about, and then they say, okay, well, what do you do? And they're like, well, here are some methods, let's call them techniques. Here are some techniques that you can use to engage the world and to check on yourself. Do you really know things? And what they emphasized was, yes, you have a tradition, but tradition is an act of cultivation. It's not just blind obedience. It's like a garden. You receive it, Oh, there's some weeds. You pull the weeds out. This thing died. You replant it. This thing needs water. You water it. This thing got too big. We prune it. This thing's not big enough. We let it grow. So that's tradition is this active, living, organic thing that each person has to participate in to move it along. And again, we all know this because we exist in families. That's how these things work. They're organic. They grow over time. But B, the second thing, if I can remember now, I bookmarked these things and then they kind of escape me. It's an organic mode, and also that it's something that sort of in the same spirit of being organic is that it has to unfold over time. It's something that is allowed to go wrong and then get corrected. Like, in other words, why am I bringing this up? Because when people are obsessed with method, they think that any error that comes out of the method means the method is invalid. And we see this with Luther too. Luther goes, the medieval Catholic Church has problems. Therefore, which was true, therefore, all the previous councils of the church were invalid. Excuse me? Descartes does the same thing. Sometimes I'm dreaming and I think I'm awake. Therefore, my senses cannot be trusted. I mean, it's like, it's this crazy throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and all modern thinkers do this. So when I say, actually, all forms of modern government are secular, people are like, well, what's the alternative? I'm like, how about a world where the church and state can check and balance each other and one's not higher than the other, like in old Christendom? And people go, but there were brutalities and corruptions in old Christendom. Therefore, that system of government is invalid because anything went wrong. It's like when new converts come into the church and they're like, oh, I found the church. And they like are so excited. This is the perfect method. And then they have drama with somebody in the church, or there's a scandal with a priest. And they're like, oh, I thought this was the church, and it's like, okay, welcome to earth. We have problems. But orientation is what's important here. So this is the method obsession. Any problem, anything that goes wrong, we have to throw the whole method out. But that's kind of utopian. That's kind of looking for this absolute certainty thing that makes no sense if you consider tradition and the lived human experience more like a garden. Things die in the garden and they have to be replanted. Weeds grow up in the garden. You have to pull them up. So tradition, even, I guess the way I would tie it all up is this. Even the objection to tradition as something that's oppressive is itself the projection of this obsession with perfect method onto tradition, which is not what tradition is. Does that make sense?
I think that's super helpful. One of the primary metaphors that John Senior, in his book Death of Christian Culture and Restoration of Christian Culture, which was one of the main inspirations for the curriculum, is that he talks about that image of cultural soil. And so to your point, this idea that tradition itself it's a sowing into each soul, right? As a soil. We all have obviously that's a biblical metaphor that all of us, our hearts are like a soil. And then the thing about soil though, is that soils in a vicinity all are going to create this organic relational situation happening even underground with the root systems and the organic matter and all this stuff. And so I think that is a wonderful reminder, just probably a great place to end on, that for families, the tradition we're offering, whether it's the great tradition, the traditions of your church, it is not a rigid law so much as this organic sowing into trying to learn to see the way the ancient church saw, to have the mind of, immersing ourselves in the historical church so that we can transmit that mind in the culture of our family in that organic human way that will just be a slow growing over time.
Yeah, life is not about trying to find, to your point, the perfect formula, because you're never going to find it, right? It's going to be an endless, exhaustive search of sort of quest after quest after quest, and then once you think you found it, you may find one that's better than the other, right? So maybe just durationally, you're there a little bit longer, but it's rather exhausting. It's incredibly exhausting, rather than this is why, if something has stood the test of time, it demonstrates potentially that the spirit is in there that is good, that has preserved it, and it's right. So submit to that very thing. And that very thing you're entering into, you want that very thing to become a part of you, become a part of your soul, rather than, hey, let me try to find that correct formula here and here. It's not about trying, like I said, to give the right method. It's about trying to find how do we actually recover? Because so much of what I love when we're having this conversation about the doctrine of realism, it's becoming whole again. It's becoming human again, because so much of the method analyzation is so about actually retaining you in a sense of a fragmented state. And the question that all of us are pursuing, according to Aristotle, is to be happy. To be happy is to be whole, because that's really where you have peace. And so really of what we're trying to pass on and present so much is, here's how you become whole. And you can say, in essence, how you actually have happiness again.
Yeah, and I guess I'm going to emphasize this even more, because people, you're sort of trained to look for the solution, and it's not that, oh, I'm looking for a brontosaurus, but I'm never going to find one because they're all extinct. It's no, you're looking for a four-sided triangle. That's why you need to give up on the method. I'm getting, the light is shining. That's why you need to give up on the obsessive search for method as a solution to reality, because you're in a delusional headspace about how reality actually functions. Reality is full of persons. Truth is a person. The church is made of persons. Human history is a family that moves through time. That's the process of endless cultivation. I mean, it's a complete category shift. So one way of saying this is that the epistemology, the worldview of the methodology, all this stuff from Descartes and the Enlightenment is just a false view of reality. That's not how reality actually works. That's why we want to give up on it. And how does reality actually work? It's this process of growth and cultivation over time. So even homeschoolers, classical educators, whatever in this country right now, we don't have a standardized curriculum. Part of that is because of the mess of our culture, but also we shouldn't stress out about that, because what we do now is building the future. You are the next link in the chain. This is where you need to be. You guys, whoever's listening to this, you are where you need to be for history. And everything you do is receiving the past and moving toward the future. And you're doing it right now. You're engaged in this act of cultivation. And that actually should give meaning, and it recontextualizes to me our daily struggle as something truly heroic and unprecedented.
Well, and to your point, to conclude with your point, the idea of participation actually removes you having a centralized focus of the individual, because to participate requires others. It requires right? It requires a community, requires living things for you also to become alive itself. And for you, it's not a static process. It's a dynamic process. It's an organic process of participation, but that fundamentally removes any type of autonomous individual. And so that's so helpful. Zach, this has been so helpful and just informative and encouraging. Where can people find just more of your work?
So I'm kind of in a lot of different places on the internet, which is confusing because one of my channels is hosted by Ancient Faith. But if you want the central place to go, it's on my Substack. So it's just zacharyporcu.substack.com. And the main thing we do over there is I do episodes for The Roots of Everything, which is my podcast. And I keep referencing it this whole show because what I do in that podcast is I basically say, look, the first step to being able to be part of tradition and understand what you're doing is to recontextualize life and everything you think about in terms of how we got here. So I do kind of this intellectual history. So I'll do different topics. We did secularism, we did government, we did science and our relationship to knowledge. We just did a one on epistemology and Descartes. And my hope is that just by kind of giving people the basics of the history of these topics, it'll help them to understand, okay, well, why do we have this kind of argument that we have about this topic in 2025? Well, actually, it's because of Descartes, or it's because of Luther, or it's because of John Adams, because of, why did we get here? So once you know the conversation, I argue, then you can really participate in it. Otherwise, you're just kind of repeating internet talking points,
Perfect. Well, we can make sure to list all that in just the description notes below. And just want to say thank you again so much for coming on. Thank you to our listeners, and we'll see you next time.